So if you are an app developer on Shopify ecosystem, I hope that you are aware of the news that Shopify has released that they have marked all the REST admin APIs as legacy. They now expect you to convert all of your REST admin API calls to GraphQL API calls. So here's the article that you should be aware of. And if you open up any API documentation page now, you should see this alert on the very top of the page. So I just wanted to take a few moments to address these changes and tell you about the plans I have. So first, let's talk about what the changes are between REST API and GraphQL admin API. So REST admin API calls are in the form of GET request, POST, PUT, PATCH, DELETE requests, but all of the GraphQL admin API calls are POST requests. The only difference that lies in the operations is in the payload that you send to the API. Otherwise, all of the GraphQL API calls are POST based. Now, if you have been keeping up with my channel and if you have watched my previous videos, I have covered quite a few videos on the GraphQL API where I have showed you how to create products using GraphQL API, how to sync orders with it, or how to fulfill orders with it. So now this information is quite relevant to you as all of the REST admin API tutorial videos on YouTube have gone out of date now, and you have to shift all of the code from REST admin to GraphQL admin API. So there are some differences that you have to keep in mind while you do this migration. So the first difference that you have to keep in mind is that the GraphQL admin API is not as perfect the same way REST API was not perfect. REST API was bound to its rate limiting by 2 requests a second, or in Shopify Plus stores, it's actually 4 requests per second. But the same thing is with GraphQL APIs as well. If you want, you can pass in a cost parameter into the GraphQL API payload, and it will give you back what the query costed and how much points is remaining and what the original consumption of the cost was. Now Shopify measures the rate limiting based on points. Every second, 500 points are rewarded back to the API rate limiter, so you can keep making API calls. But you have to keep in mind that you don't overflood it, otherwise you will start receiving 429 API codes, which means too many requests. So you may need to keep this in mind and pass a cost parameter in each of your payloads, and you actively have to write code to measure the cost so you can decide if you want to go ahead with the next request or if you want to wait a couple seconds so that the rate limiter can fill up with 500 points and you have enough to make further requests. Now, the next thing that you have to keep in mind is that you have to tell GraphQL API what you need from the API. This is the fundamental difference between REST and GraphQL. REST API often gives you everything that you need from an API endpoint, whether you need it or not. So it can give you fields that you want to work with, but it also gives you fields that may be irrelevant to you. However, in the GraphQL side of things, you have to specify which fields you're looking for, and it will only return you those fields. So studying the documentation to see what fields are supported in which query or mutation of GraphQL admin API is quite important, because if you don't ask for it, you're not gonna get it from the GraphQL admin API. That is the most fundamental difference between REST and GraphQL that you have to keep in mind, is studying the documentation. Now, the Shopify API documentation for GraphQL APIs is quite good. You can go through it and you can ask me questions if you are confused by anything. But I would like to let you know that it is quite tricky to get up and running with. There are libraries that do this for you. You can just pass your variables and it will handle all the operations for you. However, I recommend that you do it by yourself. All of the custom code that you write where you have control over every single line of the code is better for you, so you can debug the operations a little better compared to using libraries. Now, there is nothing wrong with using libraries. If it makes the job simple for you, go for it. But I recommend writing custom code, as you have seen me in the past do the same. Now, I have given out a GitHub repository that you can clone for free, and you can go through the code that I wrote so you can understand how it looks on the API documentation side versus how it really looks in the code side, where you pass in dynamic variables and you handle situations. And you can take it and you can ask questions about it. Or if you are in the Node.js side of things, there is another repository that I have given out, which was supposed to be an inventory app, but it kind of got left in the middle, which I will continue later. But the plans for this channel is now to address these migration issues from REST to GraphQL. And I will be hosting live streams. I will be posting more videos about GraphQL APIs on either Laravel or Node.js side of things. And you can join those live streams or just watch the videos that I post. and you can ask me any questions that you may have. So the next thing to keep in mind is that GraphQL admin APIs has broken down data fetching methodologies into many mutations or queries. So in one API request, you used to get all the information about the order and the line items and their inventory item IDs and etc. etc. But in GraphQL, you may need to call these APIs on a loop and taking data from one response to create a payload for another and then getting that information associated with that order. It doesn't give you everything in a one single mutation. That is something that you have to keep in mind. The next thing to keep in mind is that Shopify tells you to not send a huge payload into the GraphQL admin API. Instead, it asks you to break your queries down into small payloads so the rate limiting is in control and you get the information that you need. Sending a huge payload may consume a lot of points from your rate limiter that is assigned to you. I think it is 1000 points for every second, or the rate limiter refills itself by 500 points every second. So keeping payloads short will help in your operations, and it will make sure that your rate limiter is not overflooded already, and you will not receive 429 too many request status codes. The next thing to keep in mind is the pagination aspect of GraphQL admin API, which is very important because in scenarios where you have to loop over resources that are very large in numbers that you cannot get in one single API call, pagination allows you to loop over it when you pass in a parameter that tells the API that you have to look after the specified ID. So in the node parameter of every edge that you ask for in the products API call, let's say for example, you can pass in a cursor parameter. So every node that comes along with the API response has a cursor parameter to it, which is an obscure string, as you can see. And this cursor allows you to specify this cursor in the next API request. So the GraphQL API knows that now we have to return resources after the specified cursor. So you can use this, and additionally, you can pass in a page info parameter that tells you if the API call has any next page. So in the API response, the code that you write, you should factor in this has next page parameter, and you should check if the API really has anything else to give you after the API call. So if it is true, then you can pass in the cursor parameter of the last node of the API response. So as we can see in this API response, we will take the last cursor and we will pass it in as an after parameter in the subsequent API call that we write. So here we have an obscure string that is passed, and it gives you back the API response after the specified cursor. So you have more resources to loop through, and you can just keep doing that. Now there is one more thing to keep in mind is the first parameter. And here we can see that we are only querying for the first 3 products. This number can go up to 250. However, I recommend that you don't do that. Otherwise, you will exhaust the rate limiter of Shopify. So keeping it a small number like 25 or 10 or 30 might be a good idea. So using this pagination, you can loop through Shopify's resources over and over, and you can get all of the data that you require. It will take time. So I recommend that you push this to a background process where it will just keep happening by itself. Now, the next thing is error handling. And Shopify's GraphQL API, I would be honest with you, is not the very best at communicating what is exactly wrong in the payload that you are sending it. But they do their best. And in this example, we can see that the message says field address doesn't exist on type shop. So this is why you have to study the documentation well to see which queries provides which fields to be returned and what it doesn't support. So these messages are quite clear to understand. However, there are error messages in GraphQL admin API which are not very clear to understand, and you may need to go to Shopify community or ask somebody in a Discord group, or at the very end, you can ask me and I can help you out with that. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that the status code is always 200 when the GraphQL encounters an error. So as we can see in this example, we are passing in a product ID 123, which doesn't exist in the Shopify store. So what does it say? JSON response 200 OK, and then it says product does not exist. Now this is something again to keep in mind, that even though the JSON response says 200 OK status code, that doesn't mean that the API call went successful and you have the data that you need. So you may need to implement additional checks to really verify if you have the data that you are asking for. And here we can see how the API call looks like when you ask for the cost parameter as well. So here we have extensions in which we have cost, in which we have requested query cost 13, actual query cost 13, and the throttle status where it says maximum available as 1000, currently available as 987, and restore rate is 50. This is something that you should be able to handle to actually see if you have currently available credits good enough to make the next API call, or if not, just wait a couple seconds. Now, the GraphQL also returns 429 2-minute request response, which you should go through. And here we have the libraries that officially support GraphQL operations. So here we have Shopify API JS, Shopify API Ruby, or Axios, or some third-party admin API libraries that you can use. Shopify has linked all of this, and I will link this article in the description box so you can check this out. Okay, so that's about everything that you need to understand. In the description box, you will find two GitHub repositories, one in Laravel and one in Node.js, which you can clone and you can go through the code that I have written. I always recommend writing your own custom code so you are able to handle error handling or debug operations a little better. And let me know how your migration is going, and if you are facing any issues, my Discord server is always open to you guys. And that's about it. Thank you.